Welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video I'm going to be building the 1/48 scale Eduard Fw-190 A-3. And to mix it up, I'm going to add some extras. First off, we've got the Eduard Brassin A3 engine, the Brassin wheels set early, some brass landing gear legs with some extra resin gear doors, a photo etch flap set, and a generic Eduard photo etch set for the entire model. When working with so many extras, it's a good idea to look through the instructions to find out if you need to do any modifications to the kit parts. In these Eduard instructions, the kit parts that you need to modify or remove are marked in red. So it looks like we'll have our work cut out. Especially when it comes to the wings, where I'll have to remove a section to facilitate the flaps, whilst not cutting through the part entirely. And so the first part I did with this build was to remove those unnecessary pieces of plastic. The majority was done with my CMK razor saw. It's sharp and precise enough to work along panel lines, so the parts were scored a few times with the saw before being finished off with my scalpel. I started here with the easiest part to remove, which were the parts of the engine cowling which would be removed to show the engine on display. Once the parts are removed, I'll tidy them up with a sanding stick. The wings were the trickiest area to modify. You've got to remove a fair amount of plastic without cutting through to the other side. For the underside, you have to do this as well as removing the moulded flaps. So I made a start by removing any raised detail that would get in the way. Then I scored the seam line around the flap with my CMK razor saw. Taking care in these areas will make sure your finished result is nice and tidy. Once I'd scored down to a good depth with my saw, I used my Swan Morton 10A scalpel to finish it off, and a little bit of wiggling. And again, to make sure everything stays tidy, it'll need to be tidied up with a sanding stick. Now, because I'm going to have to remove some plastic, and I want it to be tidy, I used some scribing tape to mark off the area that I wanted to remove. I could then score a straight line with my saw, exactly where I needed it to be. Once I'd got down to a good depth, I coloured in the area that I wanted to remove with a permanent marker, just to help me keep track of things. And then I got to work on the arduous job of removing this plastic without breaking through to the other side. I needed to remove about 1mm, maybe a little less, and I started off by making some triangular cuts to remove the bulk of the plastic and then scraping the rest away carefully. It took about 2 evenings to do these modifications, spread over a few hours. The last part to remove was the lower framework underneath the bottom of the cowl, and then we could get on with the cockpit. These Eduard cockpits are usually pretty well detailed, but I decided to add a few more bits, just to improve the overall look. First, I removed some of the moulded on knobs and dials, and then drilled some holes with a 0.4mm PCB drill bit. I had loads of Anish models, knob switches and dials that I printed at home left over from my Zero project, so I popped a few of these into the holes. They just add a nice extra dimension. With those small modifications done, it was time to start bringing the cockpit together. The side consoles were carefully glued onto the cockpit tub. And you know, usually I like to add a few 3D printed parts to a build, but this time I kept it to only one. I broke the original photo etch part for this map holder, so I designed and printed my own. The rudder pedals were a faff to bend, but they glued in place nicely with some VMS black superglue. Usually I'd keep the seatbelts till last to keep the printed details intact, but this time I want to paint them, so I glued them on before I put the seat in place. And with the majority of the cockpit tub done, it's time to start adding some paint. Everything was given a decent layer of MRP black primer. I do like this primer, but sometimes it doesn't know whether it wants to be matte or gloss, and that's even after a good shaking. I think it just comes down to how thickly you apply it. To add some colour to the cockpit, I used MRP RLM 66. This was carefully black based, building up to opacity whilst leaving some shadowy areas, for that tonal variation. For this I'm using a Gallery Mobius 0.3, my first outing with this airbrush, and it seems to be working okay. For the metal area on the control column, I use an AK chrome pen. It looks great, but it's not the most accurate thing to apply. And the top of the control column was painted with some AK 3rd Gen black. The seat was based with some AK 3rd Gen very dark brown. This is from the British AFV set. This was then partially covered with AK 3rd Gen red brown, just for a leathery look. The seat belts were painted with AK 3rd Gen canvas tone. Both this shade and the leather tone were from my US Army set, the one I used to paint my figures with the Stuart. After looking at some references, I decided on a green tone for the padding of the seatbelts. I used AK 3rd Gen US Olive base here. And to make sure the buckles stand out, they were pre-painted with some white. For the straps on the rudder pedal, I used some Vallejo leather brown. And then carefully painted those buckles in with some Darkstar Metallics pewter. These painting stages in a cockpit can really help bring it to life. And finally, some of the panels on the side consoles were picked out with black. And then it was time to add a few decals to bring this cockpit to life. I wanted to do as much as I could with the brush, but I did have to use a few. I think my brush painting skills are okay, but they're not that good. I like the convenience of the pre-painted Eduard etch, but I'm not a huge fan of the colours. They can look a little grainy, so I decided to use decals for the lower half of the instrument panel anyway. I'm going for a kind of hybrid approach. Everything was then sealed in with some VMS matte varnish. The dials of the lower part of the instrument panel were picked out with some Alclad Aqua Gloss to give them a glassy sheen. And this is where my hybrid approach comes in. I used the Eduard Photo Etch for the upper part of the instrument panel because you couldn't see it as well as the lower part. I glued the parts together with gloss varnish. Not an amazing glue, but it keeps those dials transparent. The gun sight was carefully glued onto this part of the instrument panel, and I carefully painted around the reflectors with black. To add a little more depth to the cockpit, it's time to add a wash. In an unusual move for me, I used some black oil paint from Abteilung 502. This was thinned with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light, because it's pretty non-reactive, and brushed around all the details and into any crevices and cracks. Now it's time to glue the cockpit into the fuselage. My glue of choice is VMS Styrene Cement, fast or slow, but I usually use the fast one. And this is decanted into an old Tamiya bottle, just so I've got a nice brush to work with. And with the cockpit done, it was time to move on to to the rest of the construction. First up, I brought the two fuselage halves together with the cockpit seated nicely inside. As a note, if you're adding the engine, remember to pre-drill the holes on the front bulkhead before enclosing it. It makes it a hell of a lot easier. Don't forget to squeeze your parts when gluing them. Well, the fuselage halves. I always find it easier to clean up some extra glue spooge from a seam than to have to fill anything. Moving on to the wing. The wing spar that attaches to the landing gear was added. Gluing this carefully is important as it sets the dihedral of the wings. And there were a few small photo etch parts to add at this stage. For most of my extra parts, I'm using VMS Flexi 5K for photo etch. The wheel bay assembly was fairly straightforward, but you do need to be careful to make sure everything is lined up correctly. I had to remove the ejector ports for the nose machine guns. These were provided as photo etch parts, which I'll add a bit later. The Eduard Fw-190 gear bays consist of several cross beams, if that's the right term, that need to be glued carefully into place. The next part was that which filled me with the most dread. I don't dislike photo etch, but parts with big straight folds daunt me. And I don't have a photo etch bending tool, so I had to get creative. Using two steel rulers, a 15 and a 30 cm, and my scalpel, I got to work folding the upper sections of the flaps into shape. So this is the part that sits inside the wing. Effectively what I did was hold the part down using a steel rule. I then used another steel rule to bend the parts up against the straight edge of the other steel rule. And if you're careful, you can get good results using this method. Or if you've got a spare 40 quid, you can get hold and fold. The trickiest part using this method was this triangular section. It was hard to get under the very narrowest edge of the triangle. But with some perseverance, I got there in the end. The penultimate part of this metal origami was to fold over the trailing edge with the spars attached. Because I didn't want to damage, bend or break off any of the spars, I started this off with some tweezers. And the spars or partial spars, or whichever they may be, were then rotated into roughly the correct position. I haven't used any glue yet whatsoever. Now everything's kinda lined up, I used some VMS extra thin super glue and ran this into the channels that these spars or struts would sit into. They were then finally carefully positioned with some tweezers. The whole assemblies could then be glued onto the wings. I used the VMS photo etch glue for this, as it has a little bit extra positioning time. Et voila! The upper wings could then be attached to the lower wings using styrene cement. Remember those plastic chutes I cut off earlier? Well, it's time to glue the photo etch ones into place. I think they're a bit wonky, hopefully no one notices. The best thing about the generic Eduard photo etch set for this kit was that it provided blanks to cover those annoying seams at the front of the gear bays. A lot of the extras that I got for this build made most of the generic set redundant, but it does come with a few nice details. All of the parts you see here bar the flaps are from the generic set. And with those final bits done, I can attach the fuselage to the wings. After a few drops and lines of the VMS slow setting cement, I could bring the parts together and then adjust until they were in exactly the right spot. I did leave myself with a few gaps to fill, but these were filled and cleaned up with sprue goo. Once the gaps and joins were fixed and filled, I needed to reinstate some panel lines. A few light passes of my CMK razor saw did the trick. With the cleanup done, the rest of the parts could be brought together. I mean, at this stage it was pretty much just the tail surfaces. I left the rudder unglued to make it easier to paint, as it was a different colour to the airframe. But the horizontal stabilisers were glued firmly in place. It's time to get into the real nitty-gritty part of this build, the engine. This engine is a mini kit in itself, containing the engine, the cowls, some photo etch. All you need are a few pieces of brass wire to complete it. To start, the parts were removed from their resin casting blocks. Some of them were actually really chunky and quite difficult to remove. If you watch carefully over the next few minutes, you'll see some quite messy parts, at least where I've cut them. The main engine block had quite a small casting block to remove, so for this all I needed was my CMK razor saw and a little time. A few small details were then glued onto various parts of the engine. It didn't really take a lot of work to get any of these parts ready for paint, which started with some Mr. Colour GX2 Gloss Black, my go-to base for any metal work. I spray a few light coats of this and then give it a light mist of Mr. Leveling Thinner. Just enough to make sure I don't have any rough spots and it dries smooth and glossy. My metallic paint of choice this time was Mr. Colour Superfine Silver 2. I've been using these colours a lot more lately and they look really good. This was sprayed on in some really light coats at around 12 psi. The rest of the details could then be painted by hand. The push rods and the end of the piston covers were painted with AK 3rd Gen Black. I could then start bringing some of the parts together. Again, I used the VMS Flexi 5K CA4PE. It's a good consistency. It's time to add some wires. I primed the wiring loom with some VMS metal prep. It's like an etch primer for large metal parts. This was then kind of pre-painted with some MRP black. I then carefully glued the loom into place. I painted the spark plug wires with some Vallejo German yellow, but when I started folding the wires into place, things started going a bit tits up. So they were all removed and replaced with 0.2 lead wire from Ask Models. Because lead wire is so soft, it's really malleable, and it is great for spark plug wires. I did just want to persevere with the kit parts, but they didn't look that good, so my arm was twisted into submission, and that's how I ended up twisting these small pieces of lead wire into the correct shape. Once they were glued in place, out came that Vallejo German yellow again, and they were carefully painted. The rear section of the engine can then be glued into place with all its gubbins attached. If you want a tip, I wouldn't attach the wiring loom. I think this contributed to some fit issues later. I actually had to do a fair bit of surgery to get this engine to fit, which is a bit of a disappointment as it's designed for this exact kit. From the same company no less. Moving on, the exhaust pipes were pre-painted with some GX2 before being given a layer of superfine silver 2. I then built up some various heat staining and wear, starting with some alclad steel near the tips of the exhausts. This was followed with some alclad pale burnt metal. I don't know if the exhausts are steel but I presume so, and I used this chart as a guide on how to paint the exhausts. Or at least I picked a few of the graduations. I went from a metal, to a straw, to a blue, to a dark colour. So the tips were painted with some burnt iron, and the extremities with jet exhaust. The middle sections were then given some very light mistings of Tamiya clear blue. It's not perfect, but it looks alright. The ends were then lightly dry brushed with Mr. Metal Colour buffable dark iron. And the exhausts were glued into place. And don't worry, everything will be weathered later. With the engine and the main airframe complete, we can move on to painting. But first, I'll need to do a little housekeeping. To keep that lovely cockpit protected, I used the alternate canopy supplied with the kit as a paint mask. This was glued in place with VMS liquid mask, because it's easy to remove and does bond quite nicely. With that in place, let's do some priming. Or as Model Minutes would say, it's time to prime. I'm of course using MRP black primer because it's nice and thin, and I have several layers planned so I don't want to remove any detail by accident. And for these big areas of painting, I'm using a Gallery GHAD 68. This has got a pistol grip trigger. I've always wanted to try one of these styles of airbrush because my hands get fatigued quite quickly. And this does seem to help. It's not refined enough for the usual type of spraying I do, but for big areas it does a pretty good job. Anyway, the primer was built up in light layers. I did kind of a key layer, a light dusty one, and then built it up to opacity with a slightly heavier layer. I'm going to do some chipping on this build, so any areas that I wanted to show through as metal were painted with Mr. Colour Superfine Silver 2. Can't forget the 2. This was thinned with Mr. Levelling Thinner and sprayed on fairly lightly. These areas were then given a layer of VMS chipping medium, being careful to only spray on the silver areas. And then everything was re-primed in black, only lightly. I didn't want thick layers of paint here, so I could paint with my usual black based style. Before I got my teeth stuck into the camouflage proper, I had to do some small areas of RLM02. For this, of course, I used MRP RLM02 and painted all the inner surfaces of the aircraft. I added some light black basing to the inside of the flaps, just for some visual interest, even though these won't be very prominent at all. And I also very carefully freehanded the gear bays. Let's crack on with some camouflage, shall we? To start with, I used MRP RLM74. This was applied using a black basing technique, but for now I don't want to bring the finish up to full opacity. I've got an experimental step up my sleeve. So I pretty much drew in and around all the panels and rivets, in a slightly mottled way so as not to be too regular with it. Otherwise it can look like a checkerboard pattern. We want the camouflage to try and look nice and organic with its wear. RLM75 was the second colour used for this camouflage. I had a choice of two schemes lined up for this aircraft, the first one being this green scheme from the Eastern Front, but because there were so many details prominent, I wanted to keep it simple, even though that green scheme did look really interesting. So instead I'm going for this white 7 with a tassel worm, which unusually for me doesn't even have any mottling on the sides, but I don't think I've ever done an Fw-190 without mottling, so it'll make a nice change. Anyway, once the main camouflage colours were painted down in their sort of semi-done state, it was time to move on to the lower colour RLM76. While this Gallery Mobius isn't quite as refined as my Ardern Steenbeck, it still handles this black basing fairly nicely. Okay, so now it's time for that kind of experimental step that I thought I'd apply to this build. To add some more variation to the final finish, I'm going to stipple on some acrylic inks before my final paint layers, just to add some different colours and tones underneath that may show through lightly, and also add some very light, varied, hard-edged dirt marks, something you don't really get with oils, at least in the way I use them. For the underside, I used Liquitex Raw Umber and Muted Grey, so brown and purple, and for the upper surfaces, because they were darker, I added some black to this mix. It was brushed on and then stippled around with a sponge, and once I thought I'd applied enough, I blended it all together with the final paint layers. The RLM 74, 75 and 76 were lightly misted over, bringing the whole thing together. I had to be super careful so as not to hide any of my previous hard work. There were a few areas where I went a bit too heavy, but not to worry. When painting the edges of the camouflage colours, it's really easy to apply too much paint. This leaves you with a kind of outline, so I tried really hard to avoid this. But in some areas it does show through. Painting on the RLM 76 was probably the most satisfying part of this. The light blue-grey looks really nice on this scheme. Because I'd run out of MRP RLM04, that nice yellow colour, I used Tamiya X8 Lemon Yellow instead. It's not as cool as a traditional lemon yellow, and after a few layers does look pretty close to RLM04. It's not spot on, but I always go for authenticity over accuracy anyway. All that was left was to chip off some of that paint to reveal the metal paint underneath. For this I used some warm water and a tatty brush. Of course, chipping lacquers takes a small while. They're a bit more durable than acrylics, but once the water gets underneath and starts to soften that chipping fluid, the paint starts to come away a bit easier. But the nice thing about chipping with lacquers is that you usually get lots of small chips, instead of some of the big flaky chips you often see with acrylics, often leading to a more refined appearance. With the chipping done, let's move on to the decals. In my first decaling session, I applied a few decals onto the engine cowl. These were pre-treated with VMS Decal Set and Fix. This works as an extra adhesive and helps the decals really stick down to the surface. As usual, my decals were dipped in slightly warm water for about a second before being put on a piece of kitchen towel until the decals had released from their backing film. These were then slid on the surface, positioned, and then left to dry. How I usually tackle aircraft is by doing all the main markings first and then the stencils. But during my first decal session, I only had time to do a few before it was time to go to sleep. And in the morning, I woke up to a disaster. Somehow my decal water pot had leaked. I use disposable pots and they usually last a while, but my main decal sheet had sucked up all that extra water that had spilled on my desk. Marvellous. I think when retrieving a decal from the pot, I usually do this with a scalpel because I like living life on the edge. I pierced the bottom of the pot, and overnight it leaked out and seeped onto my desk. As the decal sheet was still wet, thanks to our cold, damp English winters, I did have a chance at saving the decals that were left on the sheet. So the decals I needed to use were all immediately cut away from the sheet and slightly dipped in warm water just to re-release the glue. I then applied a decent amount of VMS decal set and fix to try and negate any of the adhesive that might have washed away, and quickly popped the decals roughly into place. Once they were on, they were positioned correctly and left to dry before being given a layer of VMS decal softener. And luckily, the main markings all went down perfectly, despite the error. The stencils, however, were a different kettle of fish. I applied some of the wing markings, and they silvered. Luckily, I had a spare set from an old kit. And if you watch my videos, you know that I like to decal straight onto paint. Usually, I never have a problem. But these Eduard stencils were awful. I had to use copious amounts of VMS decal set and fix. Now usually I'd leave this to dry, without squeezing out any excess. But after a few experiments, I found that squeezing out the excess was the best way to go. For some reason, Eduard stencil decals are finicky at the best of times, and even back in my glossing before decals days, I used to get silvering too, sometimes, but it seemed like every single one of these stencils wanted to silver. And you can see my paint is pretty smooth, so it's got to be the decals, right? Anyway, with some very careful application, I managed to get all the decals down. One or two had some silvering, but I managed to eliminate it for the most of them. It's just a shame that one or two didn't want to play from either sheet. Right, let's get on to the final assembly and weathering. Firstly, the engine was glued into place. If you look closely, you can see I had to do a lot of chopping to get it to fit, both on the engine and the kit parts. I mean, it kind of fit, but it wasn't straight, and any deviation to that centre line would mean I'd have a wonky propeller, which was going to look pants. But I managed to get the engine and cowling to fit. I had to remove some of the inner surface of the upper engine cowling, underneath the guns. But even then, I had to come up with a very convoluted method to get it to dry in the right place. The landing gear and the lower flaps were pre-treated with VMS metal prep. Because they were all large metal parts, I wanted to give the paint a fighting chance of staying on, especially as they'd be handled when fitting. These were then painted in their respective colours. RLM02 on the inside, RLM76 for the outside. Superfine Silver 2 was used as a base for the propeller and the hub, before some chipping fluid and some RLM70, MRP. I like the black green the Germans used for their propellers. Makes a nice change from flat black. To add some unique wear patterns to the propeller, I used some sandpaper dipped in water to activate the chipping fluid, and also wear away some of the paint. This gave a pretty convincing effect of a worn propeller. Some final chips were added with a slightly stiff old tatty brush. And the whole propeller was sealed in with a layer of VMS satin varnish. This is always a satisfying part of any build, removing the paint masks. Luckily, my canopy stayed nice and clean. Now it's time to start adding some light weathering. I kept it simple on this one and only used a few Abteilung oil colours. I started with an overall grime wash of Abteilung 502 Starship Filth. To make sure it didn't look too uniform, I varied the intensity over different areas. For example, the rivets were given a much higher thinned wash than the panel lines. Once this had dried, any excess or dirty tide marks were carefully brushed away. I then used Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown to add some extra staining and dirt around some of the panels and hatches. I used the same colour to wash the inside of the engine bay. I wanted this to have more dirt and contrast. For the underside and the wheels, I mixed in some Abteilung 502 buff with some Abteilung 502 Starship filth. Too dark a wash on the undersides would be way too stark. So for the wash, I'll keep it light and subtle, and I'll apply more targeted grime and dirt later. The same mix was painted into the gear bays. I did add some variation with some shadow brown too, for more darker areas. The brass gear legs were glued in place with VMS Flexi 5K CA for PE. These were dry fitted copiously before I fitted them properly, as the angles were still a little vague and I wanted to make sure the landing gear looked perfect. The wheels and the landing gear doors were then glued in place, again with VMS superglue. The inner gear doors were probably the trickiest part to attach to the model. The attachment points were tiny, and it took a little while for the glue to go off. But I needed a slow setting glue to make sure they were positioned correctly, so I couldn't win either way. I was supposed to add a brake line to the wheel, connecting it to the brake line on the landing gear strut, but I completely forgot. Smart. It's time to start bringing the engine and the access doors together, but it still hadn't been grimed up, so I washed over a mix of Abteilung oils. The canopy was then glued in place with a few drops of slow setting superglue. Only tiny drops, I didn't want it to gas out and mar the clear parts. The engine access doors, the parts of the cowling, they were quite tricky to attach. The attachment points were tiny, and I had to glue them on at the right angle. So some patience and precision and some slow setting glue were the order of the day. For the lower cowling doors, I glued them in place and then turned the model over and let gravity help them dry in the right position. For the upper engine cowling doors, I had to use a paintbrush to make sure they glued in the right place. This time I was working against gravity as opposed to with it. But as soon as the superglue had started going off, I added the struts that attached the doors to the engine. This was the best way I could think of getting it to dry in the right position. But I had to work quickly. I was really conscious of time whilst I was doing this. The struts were then painted with Darkstar Metallics pewter. As a quick aside, the struts are just some 0.3mm brass wire. And then for some realism in colour, I speckled on some oily shades with oil paint. While I kept the weathering light for the most part of this build, I added some small areas of built up grime. This was done with some slightly thinned Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown, brushed into areas where grime was most likely to collect. Without wasting any time, I blended this in with my soft blender brush. This is a Terry Harrison watercolour brush, but I think it works great for blending oils. I used some dabs and flicks of the brush to distribute the dirt in a random yet controlled manner. It's amazing what one colour and some brush trickery can do to the overall appearance of a model. To finish off this section, I cleaned off the areas that would be worn by hands and boots with some VMS oil thinner. I then used some Infini Model 1/700 scale rigging wire to add the aerial to the top of the Fw-190. I use the ultra fine one because I think it looks more in scale. The 48 and 32nd cables are a lot more chunky, and this looks much better, in my opinion anyway. And once that had set, all I needed to do was to pop on the propeller. And the build was complete. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreons for supporting my work. I really appreciate your support and it helps keep me making videos. If you'd like to become a Patreon, head over to patreon.com/lpjmodels. So that's my FW-190 build. How do you think I did? I've wanted to build this kit for a long time. I bought it before I started my channel, with the intention of building it on my channel. And it's only been like 5 or 6 years. I got round to it in the end. And unusually for me, I wanted to add lots of extras. If you've watched my channel before, usually I might throw a few 3D printed parts at a kit, just to improve some small areas, and I've never really done a big conversion like this, so it was actually really fun to do. But anyway, I'd like to thank you for watching. And also please don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of my work. Also, let me know what you think in the comments below. Was it worth all the extra effort? I don't know, you tell me. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.